amazing success. And her books are very popular. She's doing very well. So we want to ask the question, well, hey, maybe writing fantasy novels is an adaptation. I know, it's far-fetched. Sit with me. Okay, just go with me a little further. There is an analogy, of course, to religion being just another kind of fantasy writing. But anyway, so here's a story where you've got somebody who, in her own autobiography has said, she started doing this because here she was a single mom, she had to raise these kids, she needed money. So she started writing these books, and of course she's been extremely successful at this. You could say, oh, reproductive success right there. This is a case of great reproductive success. But can you say it's an adaptation? And I would say, no, you can't, because there's a couple of things you need to have before you can call something an adaptation. Okay, we've got function. We can say, yes, this is functionally improving her fitness. It's working very well for her. But then we have to ask that other critical question right there. Is it heritable? Can we talk about a gene, or even can we talk about cultural transmission of this particular talent to her children? And I suspect that's improbable. I don't think there is a simple gene for skill at fantasy writing, right? We don't expect that. Maybe we'll be surprised when we dig into the genome a little further, but I don't think we're going to be surprised by that. We'll also have to wait and see, do her children grow up and all become talented fantasy writers? Are we seeing the beginning of a generation, a series of generations of great fantasy writers? Give us 50 years. Yeah?
I was just going to say, why not? We have that in music with the Bachs or the Strausses,
Oh, yes. Now we're getting into something. There's a subtle distinction to be made here. Is that a genetic trait? And I suspect it wasn't. Or can we also talk about a cultural trait? Yes, and I suspect it's cultural. Same thing with religion. This is something really difficult to sort out, but we all know that if you analyze pedigrees of religious people, you find that religion inherits very, very strongly, right? You don't have Baptists giving birth to Lutherans. And we don't think it's genetic. We think that's a cultural thing. Well, we kind of hope. I don't think it's so hard-coded in us. Many of us here have given up religion with no problem at all, so I don't think it's quite that hardwired in us. Okay, the other thing we need to demonstrate is differential reproductive success. That is an individual with a particular trait better at passing along and generating progeny than somebody who lacks this particular trait? Is there a hope that by selection this is going to spread through a population? And in this case, we don't know. Time will tell, but we kind of suspect, not necessarily, except for the fact, of course, that J.K. Rowling is going to be filthy rich and her children can afford the best educations and have a good head start.
Well, I was going to say, I've already been in this room who's been very a billionaire writer.
That's right. Yes, you could say, sure, if she offered us marriage, we'd jump at it. Well, not me, but maybe you would. Yeah. Yeah, billions of dollars, it does tend to sway people. The other thing we look for, though, is history. Even if we say this, let's say we discovered somehow that this is a heritable trait, that it's got potent effects on reproductive fitness. Can we say it's an adaptation yet? No, we can't. Maybe it's something new. In order to say something is an adaptation, we'd want to be able to say, well, it's been propagated through the population. The reason J.K. Rowling has this is she comes from a long line of successful fantasy writers, and we can't say that. So it's a complicated process. This is really hard. I got to tell you this, that we can speculate. We can say, oh, well, this particular feature has a function, and therefore we can imagine a whole chain of things that might be involved that would make it an adaptive feature. But you have to pin it down. It's really, really hard to do. Showing that it actually has a genetic background, it actually has a role in improving fitness of an individual, it actually has a history of spread through a population, takes an immense amount of work. Religion is argued as being this sort of thing where it's got a selective advantage, and having read a lot of the books on this, I got to tell you, they haven't done that work. Most of the books out there will do a good job of telling you all the wonderful functions that religion might fulfill, but they haven't yet done the work of showing that it's actually got an adaptive history and an actual genetic basis. Okay, that makes it sound like it's impossible, but it's not impossible. There are cases where we've got really good examples of traits that have been shown to have an adaptive function. And this is an example. Anybody guess what I'm going to mention here? Lactose tolerance. Lactose tolerance is a beautiful story, and it's got all the pieces that the religion story doesn't have right now. First of all, you all know what lactose tolerance is. We've all got this enzyme called lactase that we produce to help us break down milk sugars. Okay? And you die if you don't have this. In infancy, you live on milk. You don't want to be unable to digest the sugars there. So we've all got this enzyme. But in many populations, as you get older, you shut this off. Why? Because as you get older, you may not be drinking as much milk. You don't need this as much, so you don't need to be constantly sitting there pumping out lactase into your stomach, this protein that you're not going to use. So there's an advantage to shutting it down. And this is an old thing. I mean, bacteria do this. One of the classic examples of bacterial gene regulation is the lactoperon, which is exactly this. Bacteria regulate which enzymes they produce by what's in the environment. Okay. So we tend to shut down lactase production as we get older and older and digest less milk. However, certain populations have acquired the trait of expressing lactase constitutively. That means they've got it on all the time. It sounds wasteful. You're pumping out all this enzyme that you're not using, except that if you're in one of these societies where you are raising animals that produce milk, it gives you access to another energy source. So they've done a lot of work on this, and it's kind of cool stuff. They've done things like, well, first of all, they've identified the genetic substrate, so we know what the enzyme is, we know what the regulatory sequences are, and we know what modifications occurred to make it constitutively active. Okay, so we can find that right there in the biochemistry. In addition, there's been a little bit of grave digging going on. And for instance, they've dug up fossils from 7,000 years ago, which have enough preservation of the genetic material that they can extract it. And they found this lactase gene, and they've sequenced it, and they've noticed, oh, people 7,000 years ago were all lactose intolerant. So if you find a time machine, you go back 7,000 years ago, don't offer anyone any ice cream. They will hate you. So it may taste good at first, but a few hours later, they'll be on the warpath. So anyway, 7,000 years ago, we didn't have it. And it looks like about 5,000 years ago, coincident with the beginning of domestication of animals like cattle, this gene started to spread. And we can trace that spread through populations. And we can see it actually spreading. So this is a case where this is a gene that had a nice function. I mean, it allows you to digest these products from these herd animals you're raising. And milk is actually a very useful thing because you can do things like make cheese out of it, you can make yogurt out of it, and you've got a storage mechanism for preserving a very rich, very fatty food. So good stuff. So this is an excellent example of a real adaptation that spread through populations. Yes?
Is lactase or lactose needed to digest mother's milk?
Yes. So mother's milk produces a sugar called lactose. You need this enzyme to break it down. And we see this has apparently arisen independently in several different populations. So there's one allele that arose in Africa, another one that arose in Europe. You'll discover, if you look at the population data, that Asians didn't do this. You find a lot of lactose intolerance in Asians, and largely it's because Asian cultures their domestic animals were things like pigs and chickens, which you do not milk. So they didn't have much use for this. Yeah.
On this very topic, I market horse milk all over the world, and different cultures are lactose intolerant, different types of milk. And
Yes.
learn more and more about milk all the time. If you want to Google horse milk, you'll see one of my companies that it's the most amazing product. It's almost identical to mother's milk.
Uh-huh. And how does it taste, dare I ask? You should bring samples. I'd love to try it. So yes, this is an excellent example. This is the kind of work you have to do to demonstrate an adaptation. Yes?
Okay, I'm just still confused about those people 7,000 years ago. How did they survive infancy?
Oh, they had the enzyme. The change is not in the generation of the enzyme, but in the regulation of its expression. So people 7,000 years ago produced this enzyme only when they were in infancy. And then they automatically always shut it off when they got older. And it's the same with Asian populations. Asian populations produce it early, automatically shut it down when they're in adulthood.
Is there a way of bringing it back into activity again? I mean,
Oh.
if an adult were lactose intolerant and he or she were drinking milk on a regular basis, would that cause that enzyme to start acting?
Probably not, if they're truly lactose intolerant. I know for myself, for instance, that if I don't drink milk for a long time, that there will be some regulation. It will shut down, but not completely, so that I have to kind of ease back into the ice cream habit. But so there's some modulation, but it doesn't shut off as completely as it does in these populations that have lost this particular trait. Yes?
I was thinking that that in those populations, once that gene kicked in, that would be like a signal, stop breastfeeding the kid because now he's throwing up all the time.
Oh, right. So there could be other advantages to having this particular enzyme shutting off. It would be a good cue that you need to wean this kid at this particular time and tell him to quit sucking on mom and draining her down. But yes. So there's lots of we can think of lots of functional reasons why you would preserve this particular trait. Okay, I want to show you another example. This is another interesting one. This is an example of a byproduct. Okay, it's a familiar story to many of us in evolutionary biology. There's been this long-standing question: why do men have nipples? Okay, now. Women, it's no problem understanding it at all, right? Why do women have nipples? Well, because they got to nurse their children. They got to produce those milk sugars that they have the enzyme to digest and so forth. So women have nipples because they've got to do this. Men are useless, at least in this regard. But look at this fellow. He's bare-chested, and you can see right there he's got a nipple. Why does he have a nipple? Why hasn't he lost this? And it's also, it's not as if we've recently lost the ability for men to nurse their children. This is a primitive trait that mammalian males do not nurse their children. It's been this way for 60 million years, at least 60 million years. We just haven't done it. You would think by now our genes would have gotten the message. This stuff, useless. Let's trim it out. Why do we keep them? Well, the reason we keep them, of course, is that our mothers need them. So our mothers need nipples. So they've got the patterns of gene expression necessary to produce a nipple. So you can never have selection to remove that, or you have the risk of having daughters who do not have nipples who will not give you grandchildren. So that's why we've got them. And that's a perfect example of a byproduct. It's something in us males at least, we don't need. We would obviously fight anybody coming at us with a knife to chop them out. That's what this guy's doing. But they're absolutely useless. We can sort of find functions for them. We don't need to go into detail there. But they're sort of an optional feature of the organism, and there they are. And there are lots of things like that that we can imagine are in existence, and they're really hard to sort of sort out. What we want to know then is, how do we tell? How do we tell if something is a byproduct? How do we tell if something is a specific adaptation? Like maybe there was a real reason males keep their nipples, that it helps them in some way. I don't think so. Well, one thing we want to do is yes?
Sorry, just an odd counterexample. A few years ago, maybe several, 20 years ago, here in Minnesota, there was an odd case of pair of beagles who were at a breeder's farm, where the mom got hit by a car and killed the puppies were born, and the dad actually developed milk and puppies.
Oh. Okay. Yes. Do not tell young fathers that. Yeah. But it is true that you can induce lactation in males. You can do it. So it's not like we've totally lost the potential. You can give men hormones, the appropriate hormones, feminizing hormones, unfortunately, and they will produce milk and express it. So we can do that. And that's what makes it especially interesting, that males have been so lazy for 60 million years that they've never bothered to evolve this. There's the potential there, but we just, it's like housework, right? We're not going to do that either. Okay. So let's bring this back to religion. Let's think about religion now. We've got lots of hypotheses out there that religion might have a role, that it might have evolved for some specific function, and we want to know how that could have happened. Or I would argue that it's kind of like a byproduct, but we'll get to that in a moment. One of the things we do is we can kind of look at the genome. We can ask, well, is there anything associated with religion in the genome? Can we find genes that do that sort of thing? And you would be surprised at the kinds of things people have found. There has been some talk of somebody finding a God gene, and his work has been thoroughly discredited. We don't think there is one at this point. But if you look at this fuzzy little list here, for instance, if you look there at the top, this is a list of genes that are known to have interesting functions in various organisms. This is one called AVPR1A. It's a vasopressin receptor, and it's associated with creative dance performance. That's what I said when I read this. Really? Well, vasopressin is an interesting hormone. I mean, vasopressin is involved in all kinds of behaviors. It's a neuromodulatory hormone. It also influences salt balance and various things like that, so it's complicated. And all this is saying is that when they've looked at people who do creative dance a lot, they found one particular allele of this receptor in these individuals at a higher instance than they find in other members of the population. But sort of suggests maybe there's some kinds of correlations there. There's all kinds of other fun things in here. Some of them really make sense. Things like bristle pattern. I can imagine bristle pattern being regulated by genes. Memory and emotional status. All this stuff is wired into the brain somehow and into the genome. But things like religion, it's a little hard to imagine. And I suspect even in this case of creative dance performance, I bet you that gene really isn't involved in creative dance performance. When we look at these genes, we have to have a little bit of skepticism here. This is probably where it's overtly obvious. And you got to ask, what kinds of basal behaviors do people who do creative dance have that's different from other members of the population? And you might say, well, it might have something to do with a loss of inhibition. It might have something to do with, motor behavior. Are they willing to, do these flamboyant movements in public? So a whole bunch of things like that. It's probably not regulating creative dance behavior. It's probably something more basic. And that's the question. What is that more basic thing? And I know I'm running over time here. Let me move it up fast here. With the case of religion, we've got to ask, what are the functional roles that it might be fulfilling? And then we can start looking for things that might affect them. I imagine, even though this is a gang of atheists, you can probably think of functional roles for religion, right? What good is religion?
Consolation.
What's it? Consolation. Social interactions. If this is social cohesiveness, this is something that where we can use it to reassure ourselves that something's happening after death. It can console us after all kinds of events that cause grief.
Crowd control.
Crowd control. Crowd control. It makes them all sheep so they'll follow. Yes, okay. We can think of lots of functional reasons for religion. It's really easy. But the point I was trying to make before is thinking of a functional reason is not sufficient to say that it evolved for that particular function. Now, I can point you at lots of books. Let's see, I've read Atron and Connor, David Sloan Wilson, who's, Pascal Boyer right there holding up a projector. What you'll find when you read these books about the evolution of religion is what they will typically do is they will have a long list documenting roles that religion has played in society. And I don't think any of us will argue with them. Yeah, religion plays a role in society. Yes, it can be crowd control. It can be consolation. There's all kinds of good things that come out of religion. And we can imagine an adaptive significance, but they haven't done the work to show that it evolved for that particular purpose. This is a list from David Sloan Wilson. He says, let's imagine that religion evolved for some reason. It turns out there's multiple reasons it could have evolved. So it could have evolved as an adaptation. And his book he talks a lot about group level adaptation. Group level means things like social cohesion. It doesn't necessarily do anything in particular for the individual, but societies that have religion to bind them together do better in comparison to societies that do not. So that's a group level adaptation. Of course, there's also the individual level adaptation. An individual level adaptation would be, for instance, that consolation business, that people don't commit suicide when their father dies because they've got this consolation of religion to keep them going. The one I kind of like is as a cultural parasite. What this would say is that there is an adaptive reason that religion has spread, and that is that you could imagine, for instance, that con artists really like religion, that having religion in culture means they've got an active place where they can grow, where con artists can take over because they've got a nice population of gullible people that they can take advantage of. Okay, that's a really harsh way to put it, but this would be an example of a parasitic property allowing it to propagate in the population. But as I mentioned, these have not been demonstrated. We do not have solid evidence for any kind of adaptive function. I tend to favor these other two, that religion is actually non-adaptive. That doesn't mean it's bad, okay? It means it didn't evolve for a particular function. It's just there. It's a property of the population. It's a property of individuals. And that always seems a little counterintuitive to people. It has a function, but we didn't evolve to have that function. One argument is that it's an obsolete adaptation to past environments. This might be one you'd favor. For instance, you can see where evolution would favor societies that had religion as fostering tribalism, as keeping people together, keeping them working as one to accomplish a particular goal. And you would then say, well, maybe nowadays it's not so functional anymore, because you can do things like look at Jerusalem and see 3 different religions all squabbling over it and a huge amount of chaos. It's wasting a lot of time over there. You can say, okay, there's an example of something that might have been useful 1,000 years ago, not so useful today, and actually kind of destructive. This last one, as a byproduct of other evolutionary features, happens to be the one I favor. So let me just say, this is why I think people tend to be religious. And this is all saying it's not religion per se that's part of our feature set. It's not something hardwired into us. What it is there's a set of other features that we find very useful that even the atheists in this room value highly, that can spontaneously generate religious feelings. And what are they? Well, first of all, we're social animals. A single ape running around naked on the savannah is a dead ape. But in our evolution, working together as a group, good thing. We survived. We kept those little tribes going. So we have to be social. What does this mean? That means you have to get along with everybody. You can't be a big jerk and survive in a small social group. Most of these tribes are like 30 people or so, they think. And, if you're the kind of the outcast, the one who pisses everyone off, you're going to end up out there naked on the savannah watching the leopards chase after you. So you try to get along. Another thing we've got is communication and symbols. We communicate with each other. What does that mean? That means if we have some weird idea, like, that rock over there is a god, we can share that with our neighbors, and we can spread this around. So it makes it really easy for strange ideas to spread all over the place. Look at the internet. You'll see all kinds of strange ideas just kind of flying everywhere. That's what communication does. And at the same time, what we can do is we can associate those ideas with symbols. So symbols are powerful things. Look at the American flag. There's a symbol, and it has this whole layer of embedded meaning in it that we can see. Same for a crucifix, same for a Star of David. All of these things are shorthand. We can have that little shorthand symbol carry a whole lot of information from individual to individual. We learn by imitation. Personally, I think this is maybe one of the most important ones. Is that how do you learn things? You know, it's not just communication. You don't just get instructed in doing them, but people show you. This is the most powerful way to learn something, is to sit down with somebody else and see it done. So we're learning by imitation. What does that mean? How does that affect us? Well, in order to learn by imitation, you have to be able to put yourself in the other person's shoes. Right? You have to be able to imagine, oh, well, he's fixing that car, he's doing this little particular thing in the car. We can imagine being in that person's place and doing that ourselves before we even do it. So this ability to sort of imagine ourselves in some other position is an important part of it as well. And we empathize and anthropomorphize. This is all tied into that social business. And you know, if there's anything I believe is going to be socially or genetically determined, it's things like empathy. That there are going to be properties of the brain that arise in the brain that are genetically specified. And it's going to be something general, like, you know, being able to relate to some other human being. Having that sort of non-psychopathic attitude towards other people in the population. What does that do, though? That sort of sets you up for religion. Religion is really easy to arrive at from this set of behaviors. That if we can anthropomorphize, if we can empathize with another human being, and we're hunters and we're looking for antelope, what's wrong with anthropomorphizing antelope? It's kind of useful to be able to anthropomorphize and empathize. We can imagine what an antelope is doing is it's looking for food, it's looking for water. We can put ourselves in that animal's shoes and we can sort of figure out, oh, here's where I have to go to kill it. Yes?
Dan Dennett points out in his Breaking the Spell that we may have overdeveloped the ability to detect other beings that would be rewarded by evolution.
Yes.
To the point where we detect things that aren't there. And often religious feeling has some presence. So
that's right.
The other thing is the brain doesn't always work perfectly. When things go wrong, we need an explanation for it. But maybe that fits in.
Right. No, I agree completely. That evolution is very sloppy. It doesn't precisely define everything. It can have all kinds of byproducts that get dragged along with it. And here's a case where you can imagine this ability to empathize with another human being. You want to be able to extend that empathize with an antelope. And there's nothing in evolution that's going to say you absolutely should not empathize with that rock over there. So you know, you see a rock that looks like a human face sculpted into it. You start thinking, "Hey, what's he thinking?" And then because you can communicate, and because you spend a lot of time with your neighbors, you go over to your best friend there, and you're drinking the beer, and you're saying, "Well, you know, there's this rock over there. It looks like George. What's that rock thinking?" And pretty soon you're building up this cult around the rock. And it's all a natural progression.
Does this view have a general term about it that you can use to exchange this concept?
The general term right now is religion is a byproduct. That what we're seeing here is that religious impulses arise as a byproduct of these more general properties that are universally useful to any kind of social animal. Yes?
I've heard it described before as a hyperactive agency detector.
Yes. Yes, we've got a hyperactive agency detector, we've got an intent detector, we've got a pattern detector, and they all go bonkers and pick out all kinds of things. Yes?
Another way this perpetuates itself is the young are so incredibly dependent on their parents or adults to learn their social skills, so they are
yes.
open to indoctrination.
That was what Richard Dawkins talked about in the God Delusion, is that this is a really useful thing for children, is that children have built into them this obedience and this willingness to pay attention and model on the basis of what their parents are doing. And it's a good thing to keep you from getting eaten by a crocodile, is allowing your parents to tell you there's a monster living in the river, and you immediately say, oh, well, I'm not going anywhere near that river. So there's lots of things like that. And the point I want to make is this one. The religious inference is actually kind of a rational one. It's drawing upon natural substrates of behavior. It's following from reasonable things that actually will help you survive and cope in a social environment. And so it's not idiotic to be religious, okay? It actually makes a little bit of sense. Now, I think, my fellow atheists, we will agree with this. They've come to the wrong conclusion. Making these kinds of inferences isn't necessarily infallible. You can make mistakes, and we would say religious people have made a big mistake by saying that that rock over there is named George and is thinking about the well-being of the tribe, okay? And also it's drawn from inadequate data, that what we've got is a case where you get a certain amount of information that's good enough to function in a natural environment, but it may not be the whole information. You don't know anything, for instance, primitive people did not know anything about how the brain worked, didn't even know that this was the part that was responsible for thought, and so you can come to invalid conclusions. And I'll just conclude with this little suggestion. The religious inference is a reasonable one, but it's not a necessary one. And I would argue that it is not the best one. That a materialist, natural sort of inference actually makes more sense, fits the data better, and is what we've got to follow through. However, at the same time, we still have those phenomena. We're still social animals. We communicate. We learn by imitation. We empathize. Those are all parts of our makeup. And what atheism has to do is take advantage of that. That what we have to do is provide these inferences from those natural impulses that will satisfy everyone's needs for these particular sorts of solutions. We got to have something better than George the Rock. That's our goal. Now I'll leave it there and just answer questions. Yes?
Question about belief perseverance. And so take someone who's been immersed for a lifetime in mythology, superstition, say 60 years from a neurobiological perspective, what needs to happen for that person to accept a very different mindset?
Because, well, the thing is that's more psychology than neuroscience. But at the same time that people are building these inferences, they're also building defense mechanisms. They're building self-justifications and rationalizations to prop up these complicated, things like religious structures that they've put into place, and that's going to be different from individual to individual. It's going to be really hard to break it down because a lot of their identity is wrapped up in these particular things.
But is there wiring in the brain that from childhood on, just based on how they perceive the world? That's again that middle ground, and it's difficult to say. It's not like there's something genetic that hardwires it in, but there's this thing called plasticity in the brain, where connections rewire and so forth. And you can imagine, although we can't demonstrate yet, that there's all kinds of interesting rewiring going on to build a self-reinforcing neural substrate that maintains religious belief, or maintains atheistic belief, to be fair. Yeah.
I've been reading that there's been some new studies done on deja vu and how that all works, and how real deja vu feels and how real spiritual experience works. And kind of wondering, some of the research that's going on in deja vu, and how we need to explain why people are convinced of near-death experiences or spiritual encounters, that type of thing.
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of interesting phenomena out there, like you mentioned, speaking in tongues and so forth, that clearly have effects on the brain. I mean, they do things in the brain. This isn't surprising. There's lots of feedback from the environment to the brain and vice versa. And there are people studying these sorts of things. A lot of the research I don't find too credible yet, but there's some interesting stuff going on. You also mentioned deja vu. I think deja vu is an excellent example of something that was brought up earlier, that the brain isn't perfect, that the brain misfires, that you can have all kinds of interesting epiphenomena that arise. What deja vu is, I think, is you get an echo of a stored memory that's incomplete, but it's enough to give you this sensation that, yeah, I'm going through this again. And I think it's just an example of the imperfection of the brain. Let's see, somebody back here. Yeah.
In Religion Explained, Pascal Boyer talks about invisible intelligent agents.
Yes.
In societies. I don't see the leap from those particular attributes to a belief in invisible intelligent agents. Is just anthropomorphizing something enough to then cause this leap to believe that there are such things? I mean, that seems to be a big difference between religious behavior and not religious behavior.
Yes, that what's going on there, I think, what he's talking about is these invisible intelligent agents are a consequence of our mind's attempts to impose intent on everything. That we have pattern-forming minds, and we know that when we do something, there's a reason, right? You don't just randomly jump up and start dancing. You start dancing because you want to get that girl's attention or something. But we can think there's a causal agent there. What's going on with his invisible agents is that we impose that on other things that are going on. If we hear thunder in the distance, we aren't satisfying with just saying, well, this is a phenomenon that occurred. We want to know, why did that occur? And we start inventing reasons. So the simplest reason you can come up with, well, is there's an agent like me that has the capability to make noise, and that agent made the noise.
So this is part of anthropomorphizing?
Part of anthropomorphizing, yes. It's assigning human intent, human motives to objects, natural objects in the environment that may not have any such intent at all. Yeah?
Questions related to your last statement about the challenge. A social question with the Pew Research study that was given out in the blue sheet showing a strong opposition to those who are thinking this way and calling themselves atheists. I guess the personal question is, have you, because of your viewpoints, been approached, how does that all work? Because people nowadays don't want to admit you're an atheist in some ways, or more hesitant, especially in smaller communities, because you're suffering the discrimination that's
right.
evident in the Pew study. So.
Yes. Well, my general answer is we have to address these issues. We have to recognize that the religious impulse isn't just outright stupidity, that there are actually good reasons people believe in religion. Okay, that's a general one. Personally, I don't worry about that too much. I tend to be on the aggressive side. And sort of my goal is just to say, well, I'm a mean, vicious, angry atheist, and it's okay for you to be atheist because you can be an atheist who's not quite as mean as I am, and it all works out in the end. But yeah, in general, though, I think that what we need to do is develop a description of atheism that explains how atheism addresses common social needs, so that we can say, becoming an atheist doesn't turn you into this cold-hearted bastard who's going to do evil things in the world. What it means is that you have a social structure, a moral impulse that allows you to function just as well as a Catholic or a Lutheran or a Baptist in a culture. And that's sort of the challenge I see. Yeah?
Wondering about the difference between an evolutionary basis for religion, religious belief, and the position that there's nothing to it except cultural transmission. And it seems to me that if all there is culture, cultural area, that within a generation, religion could be gone from the world. If everyone,
yes,
that's a mistake, and carry on from there.
Well,
there's an evolutionary basis for it. It's all just going to be present, right?
Well, that's kind of my point. I don't think there's a strong evolutionary basis for religion itself. But I don't think we can get rid of it in a generation, and I don't think we can ever get rid of it completely, because what I'm saying here is that the religious impulse is actually a natural consequence of a lot of things that is important to us, and we don't want to eradicate any of those, right? Those are good things. Those we want to keep. And I think as long as we keep those around, we're going to have to face the fact there's going to be this frequent side effect that people will go wholeheartedly into the religious impulse. So that's why I'm saying that the ultimate solution is to have a godless philosophy that fulfills certain needs in society and can displace that religious impulse, so that we don't have to have people going to church and worshiping God in order to, for instance, practice philanthropy, or in order to do good works in the community, or in order to be able to say to people that you are a good person. Saying you're a Christian is kind of a shorthand for saying you're a good person. Why shouldn't saying you're an atheist be shorthand for saying I'm a good person? I'm a thoughtful person. I do things. Yeah.
Through the evolutionary process, what's the chances of science replacing religion?
None at all. I think it's a different thing. Science is a process of thinking. It's a process of working out solutions. It is not a substitute for things like those listed up there. You know, if you read either Boyer or let's see, what's his name, Wilson, you'll get that same message that science is actually kind of an unnatural way for human beings to think. It's a little weird. That what we're doing is we are specifically dissociating ourselves from many of those kinds of impulses. You know, that last one, we shut that off completely. And we try to imagine everything as very alien and very different. That's got its own particular functions. And so I don't see it quite doing that. It's a good practice to get into, but it's going to be hard to make that the wholesale pattern of thinking for the entire population. So I just don't. In cosmology, well, we're getting into another tricky issue. You know, I think things like cosmology and evolution and so forth, they're all right. That's the best description of the natural world. But when you get right down to it and you look at people are not going to be cosmologists. People in general, you know, other than physicists, are going to be looking for explanations the shorthand explanations that fit their worldview. You know, I don't know enough math to be a real cosmologist, for instance, but I'm willing to accept the authority of physicists. And I can see that, for instance, because I value a natural explanation, a material explanation, that their story fits into my worldview very well. People who refuse to accept natural explanations and also don't have the math are going to have problems with that. Yes?
Our need to have a narrative or a story or
oh,
way
yes.
of putting things together, it seems to be just the way we function. And I think
right.
Kind of inbred.
Oh,
you got to put meaning on stuff. You've got to create a story or narrative for everything.
Yes.
I wondered where that kind of fit in.
Yeah, actually, I'm working on a book right now, and that's the theme of the book, is that what we need these stories, that what the book is doing is putting together stories that use the natural world to explain natural events. And that's what I want to get across to people, is you don't need to imagine an invisible agent in the sky doing it. You can look at the actual evidence and see that here's a really good story that explains how life evolved, or here's how life originated, and so forth. I'm working on it. Give me time.
Oh, you're working?
Yeah. Yes. One more question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, it's okay. Yeah.
How do we compete with the sense when you're growing up, and let's say you're 10 years old, that you're told that God is in heaven, He's your Father, He loves you, He's going to take care of you. He replaces, to some extent, the parents you had when you were a toddler. And this all makes sense in a 10-year-old's mind. How do you
oh, yes.
How do we combat that sort of?
And the way we combat that is we grow up, right? That's again an example of this natural impulse from which religious ideas flow, is that we grow up with a mommy and a daddy who take care of us, and we love that. That's good for us. And we get this idea of a Santa Claus who's going to bring us presents. And we get this idea of Jesus who's going to save us. And it all flows along, and it's all very nice. But, you know, when you grow up, you leave home and you realize mom and dad aren't taking care of me anymore, and I have to do it on my own. And similarly, what we have to do is we have to get across this idea that grown-ups get out into the real world, and they don't need Jesus to take care of them anymore. That the way you thrive, the way you persevere, is by your own actions. And so that's kind of personal responsibility that I would say is the message we've got to give. It's hard, yes. Yes. But the annoying thing is that people can promise that Jesus will take care of you, and they never have to give any evidence that Jesus has ever done anything for you. But
I would like to Easy Myers.
Sure. Oh.
I'd like to present you with the 30th anniversary of Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, signed by the author. And again, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
We're going to be around here for a few more minutes
Yes.
and start a business meeting. Anyone who'd like can stay for that. And then we're going to be going to the Panda Garden Buffet for early dinner after that. So please stick around.